group of us had rented this old cabin for the weekend. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small, secluded place up in the mountains, far enough from the nearest town that you couldn't hear anything but the wind and the occasional bird. The kind of spot people go when they want to escape for a little while. We were all looking forward to a weekend of hiking, fishing, and just hanging out. There were 6 of us, 3 couples. My buddy Aaron and his girlfriend, Emma, my sister Lisa and her boyfriend Jake, and me with my girlfriend Sarah. The drive up was long, but the scenery was beautiful. As we got closer, the roads got narrower, and the trees started to close in around us. Felt isolated, but not in a bad way. It was the perfect kind of getaway. When we got there, the cabin was just as we'd expected. Rustic, a bit rundown, but cozy. The owner had left the key under a rock by the front door, and when we stepped inside, the place smelled like old pine wood and dust. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to sag a little, like the house had been here for far longer than anyone had cared to admit. The place was mostly empty, with only a few pieces of old furniture. A couch, a coffee table, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen table. But there was something about it that gave you the feeling that it hadn't been used in a while. We unpacked, settled in, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The cabin was near a creek, with trails that led off into the forest. We had a good time, but by the time night fell, the dark quiet would started to feel different. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a city, or even in a rural town. This was the kind of silence that made you uneasy, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel exaggerated. We cooked dinner that night. Nothing fancy, just pasta and canned beans, and spent the evening around the fire pit outside, chatting and laughing. The cold, crisp air felt good, and for a while it was easy to forget the eerie feeling that had settled over the place. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to get strange. We woke up to a beautiful day, clear skies, a bit of frost still clinging to the trees, and the scent of pine in the air. We decided to go for a hike before breakfast. The trail started just behind the cabin, and after about an hour of walking, we came across something unexpected. A small wooden trapdoor in the ground. It was almost hidden by a thick layer of leaves and dirt, and at first we thought it was just a storage hatch of some kind, maybe for firewood. But when Aaron, the most curious of us, knelt down to brush away the dirt, we saw that there was a lock on it. A rusty old padlock that seemed out of place on such a weathered cabin. Now, we all knew the cabin was old. The owner had told us it was built back in the 1930s and had been passed down through generations. But this was something else. Why would there be a locked trapdoor on the ground leading to who knows where? We spent a few minutes talking about it, and as curious as we were, none of us were eager to break into it. But then Jake, always the risk taker, picked up a rock and smashed it against the lock. It took a few swings, but eventually, the lock gave way, falling apart with a loud clink. The door creaked open with a thick, musty smell wafting up from below. A set of stairs led down into darkness. We all hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out, and one by one, we descended into whatever was hidden beneath the cabin. The storm cellar, when we reached it, was like something out of another time. The air down there was cold and damp, the walls made of rough-hewn stone, and there was a faint smell of mildew. It was a small space, barely big enough to stand up straight. But the strangest thing was what we found inside. The cellar was stocked with supplies, fresh water bottles, canned goods, and an assortment of other provisions. But what stood out the most were the sleeping bags. Several of them neatly rolled up and stacked in the corner. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone go to the trouble of stocking a storm cellar with food and water and leave sleeping bags down there if they weren't planning to stay? We examined the room further. The floor was covered with dirt, but it was clear that someone had been using this place recently. The cans of food were still full, the water bottles unopened. But it was the dates scrawled on the wall that sent a chill down my spine. Someone had carved them into the stone with a knife or some other sharp object. Dates, month after month, all the way up to the present day. The most recent date, the one that stood out to me, was today's date. The date we'd arrived. I felt my heart start to race. There was no way the owner of the cabin had left this here. And even if they had, Why would someone go to the trouble of leaving fresh food and water in a storm cellar with no clear purpose? The more I thought about it, the more questions popped up. Too many questions, and none of them made sense. We spent the next few minutes rifling through the supplies. There was a strange sense of urgency in the air, like we needed to leave, fast, but none of us said anything aloud. My mind was racing. I was already thinking of possible explanations, but none of them seemed right. We weren't near any towns, and the people who lived in the area wouldn't go to the trouble of setting up something like this. Eventually, we decided to leave. We climbed back up the stairs and shut the trapdoor behind us. No one said much as we walked back to the cabin, but the tension was palpable. It wasn't until we were inside and sitting down that I finally spoke up. "Someone's been down there," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Someone who's been watching this place." We all agreed. There was no other explanation for the food and the water and the dates. Whoever had been using that cellar had been keeping track of time just as we had, and they knew exactly when we'd arrived. We debated about what to do next. None of us wanted to go back to the cellar, but at the same time, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about the dates, about how they had been carved into the wall with such precision, as if someone had been watching and waiting for us to show up. But we stayed the night. It felt like the safest option, even though we were all too uneasy to sleep. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin earlier than we'd planned. As we drove away, the strange feeling in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. I kept wondering what had happened to the person who'd left those supplies in the cellar. Had they left? Were they still out there watching us? Or was there someone else who had been using the cabin long before we got there? I don't know if I'll ever know the answers, but I do know one thing. Whoever left that storm cellar behind, whoever was keeping track of the dates on the wall, they weren't just preparing for a storm. They were preparing for something else, something we weren't meant to understand. And as we drove farther down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone we hadn't seen, was still watching us. I rented a cabin in the mountains for the weekend. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden cabin tucked away on the edge of a state park, the kind of place people go to get away from it all. There was no phone service, no Wi-Fi, just peace and solitude, the perfect spot for hiking and clearing my head. I arrived on a Friday evening, the sun just setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin itself was rustic, nestled among a dense cluster of evergreens. The owner had left the key under a rock, which I thought was a bit odd, but the place was isolated, so maybe that was normal. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and pine filling the air. It was quiet, too quiet. I unpacked my things, stashed my food in the small kitchen, and opened a bottle of beer as I looked out the window. The sun was slipping behind the peaks, leaving a golden hue on the distant hills, the kind of scene you'd expect in a postcard. Yet something about the place unsettled me. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen a soul since I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin. Or maybe it was the isolation, the overwhelming silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. I decided to go for a hike the next morning, explore the area a bit. There was a small trailhead marked on the map the owner had provided, so I figured I'd start there. It was about a mile into the woods, a well-trodden path that eventually veered off toward a ridge offering a good view of the surrounding valley. I woke up early, grabbed my pack, and set off. The air was crisp, cool, the ground damp from the night's dew. The forest was thick with old-growth trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted like something out of an old fairy tale. As I hiked, I passed a few other small cabins, but they were far off the trail, secluded like mine. It made me wonder who else lived in this stretch of wilderness. I didn't see anyone, and the further I walked, the more I realized just how quiet everything was. No cars, no voices, not even a distant hum of civilization. As I ventured deeper, I started noticing something strange. The trail was lined with trees, each one sporting something that didn't belong. Small black boxes nailed to the trunks. At first, I thought they were birdhouses, but as I got closer, I realized they were trail cameras. A lot of them, maybe a dozen or more. Some were camouflaged, others just plain black, all with lenses staring out toward the forest. They were pointed in the direction of my cabin. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual to see trail cams in the woods. Hunters use them to scout for game, and photographers sometimes set them up to capture wildlife. But this many, all aimed at my cabin? It didn't sit right with me. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Who had put these cameras up? And why were they pointed at my cabin? I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I immediately turned around to head back to the cabin. I didn't know if I wanted answers, but I knew I needed to figure out what was going on. I made my way back to the cabin, passing more cameras as I went. I could feel their lenses following me, even though I wasn't sure who was behind them or why they were there. When I returned to the cabin, I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, brought it outside, and sat on the porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. My mind raced. Whoever had put those cameras up knew the area too well. They knew exactly where to place them, and I was certain they were watching. Later that afternoon, I decided to check the cameras. I didn't have the right equipment with me to view the footage on site, but I was determined to find out who was behind them. I walked the path again, more carefully this time, and took note of each camera's location. As I approached the first one, my stomach dropped. There was no SD card in the camera. I checked the others. Same story. Empty. All of them. It didn't make sense. If someone was watching, they'd have to be retrieving the footage somehow. But who was it? And why would they leave the cameras behind if they knew I was here? I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the whole situation felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why had they been pointed at my cabin? Why hadn't the SD cards been left in the cameras? It was almost like whoever set this up wanted me to know I was being observed but didn't want to leave any trace. That night, I tried to relax, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, had me on edge. I kept imagining the cameras out there, their lenses trained on me through the windows. But I didn't want to overthink it. Maybe I was just paranoid. The whole situation could be explained away easily enough. People set up trail cams all the time, right? Maybe it was someone who rented the cabin before me. Or maybe it was the owner himself, checking to make sure no one was trespassing. I didn't know. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, the kind of sound that could have been the wind, or maybe the rustling of an animal. But it didn't feel like either. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Someone was out there. I waited, barely breathing, trying to make sense of the sound. It came again, louder this time. A twig snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot. Whoever it was, they were close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. I swung the light around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the darkness of the woods. The sound stopped, and I stood there for a while, the chill creeping up my spine. After a few minutes, I reluctantly went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I packed up my things and decided I was leaving. The hike, the cameras, the feeling of being watched, it was too much. I couldn't stay another night in a place that made me feel like I was being hunted. Before I left, I checked the cameras one last time. The SD cards were still gone. I didn't bother to figure out who had taken them. I didn't care anymore. I was done with the cabin. I drove away as fast as I could, the twisting roads taking me farther from the place I had rented for the weekend. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first person who had stayed there. Whoever had put up those cameras and taken the SD cards had been keeping a close eye on that cabin long before I ever arrived. I don't know who it was or why they were watching, but one thing was clear. They knew exactly who had stayed in that cabin, and they weren't finished with me yet. I had always known that getting lost in the woods wasn't exactly rare, but that didn't make the experience any less unsettling. It's one thing to take a wrong turn on a hiking trail. It's another when the trees seem to swallow you whole, and the sun begins dipping below the horizon, and the GPS starts losing signal. That's where we were, miles deep into the woods, with the roads becoming less distinguishable by the minute. I was with my friend, Derek. We had planned to do some casual camping, nothing too serious. The kind of trip where you set up a tent, fish in a nearby stream, and maybe, if the weather's right, make a fire at night. But that plan turned sideways fast. What was supposed to be a quick jaunt down a logging road turned into something much worse. It all started with the trailhead we missed. We'd made a wrong turn onto what appeared to be an old logging road. I didn't think much of it at first. Roads like that were common out here, but as we drove deeper, it became evident this wasn't a place people typically visited. The road grew narrower, the trees thicker, and the air heavier. The hum of the engine seemed to fade, replaced by the unsettling sound of silence, interrupted only by the occasional crack of a distant branch or rustle of leaves. "I think we should turn back," Derek said, glancing nervously at the trees pressing close to the sides of the truck. I nodded but didn't say anything. The thought of turning around didn't feel right either. It was starting to feel like we had to push forward, like we needed to get somewhere I couldn't quite explain. We both knew the truck's gas tank wasn't enough for a long haul, but we figured we could at least get to the top of the ridge, find a place to set up camp, and then figure it out. We'd done it before, but then the truck sputtered. "Not now," I muttered under my breath as I tried to start the engine again, but it was no use. The truck was done. Derek and I got out to look at the truck, but there wasn't much we could do. The dirt road, long abandoned by the looks of it, wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd find a mechanic. The thought of trying to walk back down the road, with night approaching and no way of telling how far the nearest town was less than appealing. "Well, at least it's not too far," Derek said, trying to reassure himself as much as me. I nodded, although I wasn't convinced. We decided to leave the truck behind and start walking. First, it wasn't so bad. The road was still wide enough for us to follow easily, and we made good progress. But after an hour of walking, it became clear that this road wasn't leading anywhere. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and the air turned cooler. Our steps slowed as the shadows deepened. We came to a fork in the road. One path seemed to curve back toward the truck, but the other, darker, more overgrown, stretched further into the trees. "Which way?" Derek asked, looking at me. I stared down both paths. Neither of them looked promising, but we had no choice. We took the overgrown path, thinking it would lead to something, anything. That was when we first saw it. Hidden behind the thick curtain of trees and brush, barely visible through the undergrowth, was a small structure. At first, I thought it was just a dilapidated shack, some forgotten relic of the past. But as we got closer, the shape of the cabin became clearer. It wasn't a shed or an abandoned barn. It was an actual cabin, the kind you'd expect to find at a remote campsite. It was isolated. No cars, no trails leading to it. Just a little wooden structure that seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. We approached cautiously, Derek muttering something about how we should leave. I agreed. I didn't like the idea of strangers living this far out in the woods. The cabin felt wrong. But as we stood there, the door creaked open slightly, as if it had been left ajar by whoever had been inside. For a moment, we stood there, just staring. But then, with the light fading and no other options, I walked up to the door and gently pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was small, but it had a lived-in feel. Sleeping bags were spread out on the floor, and beside them, a small wood stove still had a faint heat coming from it, though it had clearly not been used for a while. There were open cans of food, beans, soup, half-eaten and left carelessly on the floor. My stomach churned. Who lived here? And why did it feel like they had just disappeared? There were no signs of personal belongings beyond the food and the sleeping bags. No clothes, no photos, nothing. But something else caught my eye. On the wall, scratched in what looked like a sharp object, maybe a knife or a piece of metal, were a series of dates. Some were crossed out, others circled. And then, there it was, today's date written in fresh markings. The hairs on my neck stood up. How was it possible that someone else, someone who had been here recently, had written the date, today's date, on this wall miles away from the nearest road? And why? What the hell? Derek muttered, looking at the list of dates. His voice was low, like he was afraid to speak too loudly, as if the cabin might answer back. I didn't say anything. I was too busy scanning the room. The more I looked, the more the place felt wrong. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't a retreat. It was something else. "Should we leave?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. Something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt the need to stay, to dig deeper. Maybe we should look around more, I suggested, even though part of me screamed to leave. But I needed to know. I needed answers. We walked deeper into the cabin, through a small kitchen area where empty cans and wrappers were scattered across a table. A faint smell of stale food hung in the air. Then, beyond the kitchen, we found a small closet. Inside was a stack of neatly folded clothes, too neatly folded. They were all a bit too clean, as if someone had packed them away for storage, but had never come back to use them. The unsettling thought that had been growing in the back of my mind suddenly became real. Whoever had been here was not supposed to be here. They'd left in a hurry. I turned back toward the list of dates on the wall, and as I stood there, my gaze shifted to something else. A small, weathered box on the table. My heart skipped a beat. It was a journal, old and covered in dust. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside were dates, just like the wall. More lists, more names, and more strange symbols. But what made my blood run cold was the last entry. A name, followed by a line that read, "They are watching." I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to leave. But as I turned to tell Derek, I heard it. A distant sound. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I grabbed Derek by the arm and yanked him toward the door. We ran. There was no thinking, no hesitation. Just the primal need to get out of there. We didn't look back until we were miles away, back at the truck. We didn't talk much on the drive back, too afraid that if we said anything, it might make what we had seen real. When we finally reached the nearest town, we stopped at a gas station. The first thing I did was check the date. The date on the journal, the date on the wall, and then the date on the calendar in the gas station. It was today's date, but what we saw, what we found, wasn't just some forgotten cabin in the woods. It was a warning, a message, and I still don't know who had been watching. I booked the cabin because I wanted to get away. No drama, no noise, no people. Just a week alone in the woods to clear my head. It was an old rental I found online, tucked deep into a part of northern Michigan I'd never been to. The place didn't have cell service, and the only internet came from a weak satellite connection that cut out with the wind. That was fine with me. I wasn't going to stream anything or check email. I packed books, some warm clothes, a bunch of easy food, and drove the 6 hours out of the city in my old Subaru. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was rougher than expected. My GPS cut out a few miles before I got there, and I had to rely on printed directions. The trees crowded the road more and more the deeper I went. I passed one other car parked at a pull-off, maybe a hiker's. Otherwise, it was all forest. The cabin showed up suddenly at the end of a long stretch of brush. Just a small single-story place with a tin roof and a covered porch. No other buildings in sight. That was what I wanted. The first night was quiet. The sun went down faster than I expected, hidden by the tall pines. I made a quick dinner, read a little by lantern light, and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee. There was a small bathroom in the cabin, but no curtains on the windows, which made me feel exposed. I tried not to look outside. Still, on my way back to bed, something caught my eye. There was a red light, faint, flickering, deep in the woods. I thought maybe it was a tail light, maybe from an ATV or something, but it didn't move. It just pulsed dimly between the trees, way off in the distance. I stood there staring at it, not quite sure what I was looking at. After a minute, it stopped, just blinked out. I shook it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee and tried not to think about it. But I left the table a few times to look out the window in that direction. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. That whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone. I hadn't really been alone in years. I thought maybe my mind was adjusting. The second night, the red light came back. Same spot, same flickering pattern. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, looking out through the kitchen window. I timed it. It stayed on for exactly 2 minutes, flickering like a weak LED, and then it disappeared. It didn't move. It didn't get brighter or dimmer, just blinked and vanished. By the third night, I couldn't pretend it wasn't weird anymore. I tried to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a hunter's motion-activated camera? A broken trail marker? Still, I didn't like that it always turned on at night, and always while I was inside. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off and sat on the floor next to the front window, watching the forest. Sure enough, around midnight, the red light turned on. Same spot, same flicker. This time, I got up and opened the front door as quietly as I could. The cold air rushed in. I stepped outside in my socks, heart pounding. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked harder. The light was maybe 50 or 60 yards into the trees. Not close, but close enough to see that it wasn't moving. I stood there for a full minute before going back inside. I closed all the curtains, turned on every light in the cabin, and slept on the couch with a kitchen knife in my hand. By the fourth day, I was sick of it. I walked into the woods during daylight, trying to find the source. I marked a tree near the cabin with a red bandana and headed in the direction I'd seen the light. The ground was soft with pine needles. After about 20 minutes of searching, I found it. There was a trail camera strapped to a tree, one of those big ones with a camo pattern plastic shell and a blinking red light. Motion activated, the kind hunters or researchers use. It looked new. The bark around the straps was barely pressed. Below it, some leaves were crushed down like someone had been standing there. I looked around, half expecting someone to be there, but it was silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I took out my phone to take a photo, but of course, no signal. I thought about trying to open the camera, but I didn't want to touch it. I backed away slowly and went straight back to the cabin. The rest of the day, I kept every window shut tight, but I couldn't stop thinking about the camera. Why would it be aimed at the cabin? I wasn't on public land. The property came with a few acres, and the listing never mentioned anything about trail cameras. Someone had set it up recently, someone who knew I was here. That night, the red light didn't come on. That almost made it worse. I kept waiting for it, but the woods stayed dark. Around 2 a.m., I went into the bathroom and turned on the faucet. When I came out, I caught movement at the corner of the window. Not the light, not an animal. Someone was standing behind a tree, not far off, just past the tree line. I froze. My legs wouldn't move. I stared at the spot where I saw the shape, but it was gone. Where they were hiding. The bathroom window didn't have a curtain. I dropped to the floor and crawled into the hallway, heart slamming in my ears. I sat there for what felt like an hour, knife in hand, not breathing. I didn't hear anything, nothing at all. Finally, I moved into the bedroom and sat with my back to the door until morning. At sunrise, I packed my bags. I didn't care that I had 3 more nights left. I stuffed everything into the car and didn't even lock the door to the cabin. I drove straight out of the woods and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, then kept going until I found a gas station with cell service. I called the rental agency, told them someone had been watching the cabin. They didn't sound surprised. The woman said something about trail cameras being common up there and suggested maybe a neighbor had one set up for wildlife. But I knew better. That camera wasn't aimed at animals. It was aimed at me. I told her to check the property herself, that there was a camera out in the trees and someone standing behind them. She paused, then said they'd make a note of it and hung up. That was a year ago. I still check that rental website sometimes. That cabin's still listed. Same photos, same description, same deal. But now I look closely at the pictures. One of them shows the cabin at night with the porch light on. And way off in the distance, behind the trees, there's a tiny red dot, blinking. We wanted quiet. That was the whole point. A week away from everything: phones, jobs, traffic, people. just quiet. It wasn't a fancy trip. We weren't staying at a big resort or flying to another country. Just a rented cabin up in the mountains, about 10 miles down an old, winding forest road. Nothing special, just trees and time. We got there on a Sunday. The cabin was small, set back from the gravel road about 50 yards, hidden in tall pines and dense underbrush. A little wooden porch, one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of wind through trees and a creek that ran maybe 100 yards behind the place. Felt perfect. The road leading there was narrow and rough. One lane, gravel in some stretches and dirt in others. There were little pull-offs every few hundred yards. Just patches of cleared ground where someone could stop if they had to pass another car or stretch their legs. We'd passed maybe 5 of those before reaching the drive that led to our cabin. Each one was empty. That first day was nice. We unloaded the car, unpacked, made something simple to eat, then sat on the porch until the light faded out behind the hills. Nothing happened, just quiet. But the second day, something caught our attention. We'd gone into town that morning to grab some groceries, about a 45-minute drive each way. On the way back, just after turning off the main road and onto the mountain one, we passed a pull-off and saw an old, beat-up pickup parked there. Nothing unusual by itself. Old Ford, maybe early 2000s. Faded red with a silver tailgate, one of the rear lights busted, and the paint along the sides chipped and scratched like it had been hauling brush or tools for years. The windows were tinted dark, and it had one of those metal headache racks behind the cab. No one was in it, just parked there with the engine off. Didn't think much of it at the time. Could have been someone hunting or hiking in the woods. Could have been broken down. But on the way to the cabin, we saw that same truck again, maybe a mile up, parked in another pull-off. Same truck, same dents, same busted taillight, different spot. I remember slowing down, thinking maybe I was wrong, but there was no mistaking it. Same make, same plate, same damage. It had moved and it was there before us. Still no big deal. Maybe someone was checking trailheads. Maybe they moved from one to another and we just happened to catch both. Strange, but not worth worrying about. That night was colder. We made dinner, lit the fireplace, and played cards at the little table near the window. Sometime after 10, we turned in. The woods outside were dead quiet. I fell asleep fast. The third day, we decided to stay in. Cooked breakfast, read books, took a walk up the road for a bit. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. Around midday, we walked about a mile down the road just to stretch our legs, then turned back. That was when I noticed it again. The same truck, parked at a pull-off maybe a quarter mile from our cabin, pointed toward it. Still off. No one around. It hadn't been there that morning. It sat there, quiet, with its nose facing directly toward the narrow entrance of our cabin's drive. I kept staring at it, wondering how someone could have gotten it there without us hearing. We hadn't left the property all day. There wasn't another road leading to that spot. It had to have passed by us. No movement, just the truck quiet in the trees. Same dents, same tailgate. Nothing new about it except that it was closer. We walked back to the cabin. I checked the windows and door locks. All good. I didn't say anything out loud, but I felt it, that tight feeling in your chest like something's just a little off. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept listening for sounds outside, but the woods were dead still again. Next morning, we drove back to town to pick up more supplies. It was raining lightly, gray skies and cold drizzle hanging low over the treetops. On the way, we passed another pull-off and saw it again. Same truck, parked again. This time, the driver's side door was open. No one inside, just the truck sitting there, quiet, with the door wide open like someone had stepped out and disappeared. There weren't any houses nearby, no stores, no trails, just trees and thick brush for miles in every direction. We didn't stop, just kept going. On the way back, it was gone. That evening, I stayed outside longer than usual, just sitting on the porch watching the trees. I kept thinking about the truck, about how it kept showing up always closer, always quiet. At some point after sunset, I noticed the wind had stopped. The branches weren't moving. No birds, no crickets, Nothing. Just silence. I stepped off the porch and walked out toward the driveway, where our car was parked. That's when I saw the truck again. This time it wasn't in a pull-off. It was just at the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, partially hidden behind some thick pines. It wasn't on the road. It was in the woods, backed in between two trees like someone had driven off the gravel and parked it in secret. Engine off. Driver door open. No one in sight. That tight feeling came back hard. I walked slowly back to the porch, trying not to make a sound. I stayed there, sitting in the dark, watching. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No light. No voice. Just that truck sitting silent, half swallowed by trees. I stayed awake all night. The next morning, I walked out with a tire iron in hand and checked the spot where it had been. The truck was gone, but the ground showed the signs. Crushed leaves, tire ruts, damp dirt pushed down in clean arcs. It had been there. No mistake. We packed up that afternoon. We were supposed to stay 4 more days, but something didn't feel right anymore. I didn't say it out loud, and neither did she. We just both knew. The air had changed. The cabin didn't feel like a place to rest anymore. Felt watched. We drove out around 3 p.m. I kept checking the mirror as we left. The road was clear. No sign of the truck. But about 5 miles down, at the edge of a wide pull-off where the trees opened just a little, we passed it again. Parked. Quiet. Driver door closed this time. As we passed, I caught a glimpse through the windshield, just shadows. Couldn't see anyone. Could have been empty. Could have been not. We didn't stop. Once we got back to town, I went into the little sheriff's station and told them what we'd seen. The woman at the desk asked a few basic questions and said they'd check it out. That was it. I didn't press. A week later, back at home, I looked up the area online, searched through forums and threads about cabins, roads, and strange sightings. Found one post, just one, from a guy who said he'd rented a place up there 6 months earlier. Mentioned a truck, beat-up Ford, kept seeing it along the road. Said it never followed, never chased, just watched. Said it parked close one night, and after that, he left early. No answers, no theories. Just said, felt wrong. I don't know who owned that truck. Could have been some mountain local watching cabins. Could have been someone squatting out in the woods. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe worse. All I know is that we weren't wanted there. Not by something loud or violent. Just by something that knew how to wait. And when we left, it didn't follow. It didn't need to. I'd taken a few weeks off work to clear my head. No big reason. I just needed quiet. A couple of things had piled up. Long hours, short tempers, barely sleeping right. I wanted space. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to be anywhere near traffic, phones, or meetings. So I rented a cabin way up north in the mountains, about 3 miles past the main road. It was one of those isolated places, quiet, buried in trees. A simple wooden place with no Wi-Fi, barely a signal on my phone. A little porch out front, a wood stove inside, and nothing much else. It was perfect. The first few days were what I needed. Mornings were cool, with mist hanging low over the hills. I cooked simple meals, walked the trails, and listened to the wind slide through the branches. The only sound at night was the occasional creak of the cabin settling or a squirrel moving around outside. I'd never slept better. No stress, no people, no pressure. Just trees and time. On the 4th morning, I woke up early. It was still dim outside, maybe around 6. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch, just listening. I could hear birds farther off. No cars, no voices, not even a plane overhead. It felt like I was the last person left alive. Then, as I sat watching the trees shift in the breeze, I noticed something. A path I hadn't really paid attention to before. It curved off the back of my cabin's main trail, almost hidden between 2 boulders. It looked narrow and overgrown, not part of the main hiking paths marked on the little map the owner had left on the table. Something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just getting restless. I finished my coffee, pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight just in case, and started walking. The trail was rough and uneven, winding upward through thick trees. Branches hung low in places, and the ground was soft with damp leaves. Felt like no one had used that path in a long time, but it was still there and it definitely went somewhere. I kept walking, listening to the crunch of twigs under my boots. After about 20 or 30 minutes of steady climbing, I noticed the smell of smoke. Not a fire, just the faint scent of a wood stove. Burned pine or birch, sharp and dry. It was out of place. I stopped walking and listened, but I didn't hear anyone, just the same soft wind through the trees. I moved a little farther and saw it. Another cabin. It looked older than mine. The roof had patches of moss on it, and the steps leading up to the porch were crooked. But it wasn't abandoned. There was a set of boot prints in the mud near the door. Not fresh, but not washed out by rain either. The door was open. Not wide open, just cracked, maybe a few inches. Enough to see darkness inside. I stood there for a second. I didn't want to just walk up uninvited, but something about it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I called out once, just a quiet hello, not loud, just in case. No answer. I moved closer, stepping onto the porch. The wood under my boots creaked. The air smelled stale and cold. I nudged the door open. Inside was still. It wasn't trashed, just stopped. On the table by the front window was a plate with a half-eaten sandwich on it. Bread starting to curl at the edges. A mug with coffee still in it, dark and half full. A fork on the floor like it had been dropped by accident. The stove in the corner was dead cold. I stepped inside. There were 2 suitcases by the far wall. Zipped shut, clean, untouched. No dust. A jacket was draped over the back of a wooden chair like someone had just slipped it off. On the counter near the sink were 2 wallets, both open. IDs and cards fanned out like someone had been looking through them. One of them had a receipt sticking out, gas station, dated 3 days ago. The whole place looked like someone had just stepped outside and never came back. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no overturned furniture. The bed in the back was made. A book was open on the couch, face down like someone had left it there and planned to come right back to it. I stood there for maybe a full minute, not moving. It didn't make sense. Everything felt paused, like time had stopped right in the middle of someone's afternoon. I walked to the back of the cabin and opened the door to the small bathroom. It was clean. Toothbrush on the sink, towel hung neatly over the shower rod. No signs of mess, no foul smells, just still air and that faint wood smoke scent that had now mostly faded. I looked around the whole cabin for any sign of where they went. No notes, no tracks leading out the back. I stepped off the back porch and checked the grass, the dirt, the brush nearby. Nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no broken branches. It was like the 2 people living there had stood up in the middle of lunch, stepped out the door, and dissolved into the trees. I stayed there for a while, trying to piece it together. The food, the wallets, the suitcases, they all pointed to people planning to stay. No one hikes out into the woods and leaves their wallet behind. That's not how people are. I took one of the wallets and checked the ID. A man from downstate, 46. The receipt showed he'd bought fuel and a sandwich from a place maybe 60 miles south. That was recent. There was another ID in the other wallet, female, 39. I don't know if they were married, friends, or what. I didn't want to dig too much. I wrote down their names in a small notebook I'd brought with me, just in case. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. Took a long time to walk back to my cabin. The trail felt colder than before. I kept stopping to listen, not sure what I was expecting to hear. When I got back, I locked the door, which I hadn't done the previous nights. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me freeze. The next morning, I packed up early and drove down to the nearest town. It was about 30 minutes away on a narrow, winding road. A single gas station, a diner, a post office, a sheriff's station. I went straight there and asked to speak to someone. I told them what I'd found. I didn't embellish anything, just gave the facts. A cabin up the trail, the door open, food on the table, personal belongings untouched. No sign of the people. The deputy at the desk looked tired. He nodded slowly, didn't even seem surprised. He asked me to show him where the trail started. I drove him back up to the spot and pointed out the hidden path. He didn't say much. He just wrote some things down and thanked me. I asked him if he'd heard of anything like this before. He looked at the trees and said, "It happens sometimes." That's all he said. I went back to my cabin to grab the last of my stuff and left that afternoon. I haven't been back since. I tried checking the names I wrote down once I was home, but nothing came up. No missing persons, no news stories, no reports. I tried calling the sheriff's station a week later just to ask if they'd found anything. They said they'd investigated and didn't find anything unusual. Probably moved on, they told me. But I don't believe that. People don't leave mid-meal. They don't leave their wallets, their bags, their jackets. They don't walk off into the woods without their boots. And if they did leave, if something scared them or pulled them away, why didn't they come back? Why didn't they take anything with them? It's been over a year now, and I still think about that place more than I should. I can still see the sandwich on the plate, the mug with the cold coffee, the coat on the chair. I see those 2 suitcases lined up by the wall, like passengers waiting for a train that never showed. Whatever happened in that cabin wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, but it was final, and it left no trace. I don't know exactly what made me want to rent a cabin that deep in the woods. Maybe it was the idea of getting away from everything. The city noise, the traffic, the constant buzz of notifications, meetings, and people, always people. I'd spent the last few years in a tight apartment stacked between strangers, and for once, I just wanted space, silence, time. The listing was simple. A 1-bedroom off-grid cabin sitting on about 40 acres of privately owned forest in northern Minnesota. The photos showed a rough wooden structure with a tin roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch that faced nothing but dense trees. No cell service, no internet. The owner had warned me it was very remote and required about 45 minutes of dirt road driving from the last sign of pavement. That was perfect for me. I packed up a cooler, 2 water jugs, a camp stove, some canned food, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, and a small solar battery for my headlamp and Kindle. I drove north for most of the day, the roads getting smaller and emptier until I was rolling over gravel and dodging potholes that looked like small ponds. By the time I made it to the little pull-off that marked the trail to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I left my car by the edge of the woods and hiked in the remaining quarter-mile on foot. It felt surreal. Nothing but trees and underbrush, wind moving gently through pine needles, and that rich, quiet smell of moss and dirt. The cabin appeared like something out of a postcard. Just old, sturdy wood, a small chimney poking up from the roof, and steps leading to a covered porch. Inside, it was just as simple. 1 room, a cot in the corner, a wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, some shelves with old supplies, candles, matches, pans, canned beans that looked a decade old, a tiny bathroom off the back with a compost toilet and a basin for washing. No shower, no sink, no running water, just what I needed. I unpacked slowly, getting settled. I cracked a window to let in some fresh air, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and set my cooler in the shade outside to stay cold longer. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire in the wood stove, cooked some beans, and read by the flicker of my headlamp until I dozed off. By the second day, I was adjusting. I walked some of the trails around the cabin, which were faint and barely used, probably made by deer or whoever owned the land before. There were no signs of people, no litter, no tracks, nothing but squirrels, birds, and once, a fox that darted off before I could get a good look. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, careful not to venture too far. I didn't have a map, and the last thing I wanted was to get turned around. It was that third night when things started to feel off. I had just climbed into my sleeping bag after finishing a small dinner. The wind was picking up outside, and the trees groaned as they moved. I'd heard wind before, but this was different. Something about it felt unnatural. It wasn't the sound itself, but the way it dropped suddenly, leaving an almost dead silence behind it. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing this low, distant thump. Not like a tree falling, more like something hitting the ground rhythmically. I told myself it was probably a branch caught in the wind, tapping against the side of the cabin or something, but it kept going. 5 or 6 slow, spaced out thuds, then silence. A few minutes later, it would start again. The same pattern. 5 or 6 hits, then nothing. I stayed in my bag, barely breathing, listening. Eventually, it stopped. In the morning, I walked around the cabin to check. Nothing looked out of place. No branches, no fallen trees. I didn't see any prints or marks in the dirt. I convinced myself it was just something natural, an animal or maybe my own nerves. That's what being alone in the woods does to you, right? You start hearing things. I spent that day staying closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood, cleaned the small pan I'd used, and double-checked my supplies. When I stepped out back to take a leak, I noticed something in the tree line, off to the east, maybe 30 yards in. A stick, tied with something red. It was thin, maybe a foot long, and tied to another stick with what looked like a strip of cloth or ribbon. It was hanging in the shape of a crude cross, swaying just slightly. I didn't remember seeing it the day before. I walked over, trying to stay calm. When I got closer, I could see that it wasn't a ribbon. It was cloth, torn and dirty, and there were black smudges on it like dried mud or ash. The cross wasn't tied so much as woven, like someone had taken time to twist the sticks together and secure them tightly. It wasn't just random. I didn't touch it. I stood there staring for a few minutes, heart picking up speed. My first thought was some kind of hunting marker, maybe a boundary post, but it didn't look official and I didn't see any others around. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing that same slow thudding, always just after midnight, always in a group of 5 or 6, then silence. I thought about packing up and leaving in the morning, but the stubborn part of me said I was being paranoid. I paid for the week. Maybe I was just going stir-crazy from the quiet. On the 5th day, I found more of those stick things. 3, actually. 1 to the west, 1 to the north, and another about 50 feet behind the cabin. All of them were different. Some made of bark, others with moss stuck to them. One had a feather tied into it. Each time, the cloth was different too: blue, red, dirty white. All torn, all weathered. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt like something was being placed. Maybe someone was messing with me. A local who didn't like outsiders, or the landowner playing games. But how would they know I was even there? No one was supposed to be around for miles. That night, I locked the door and slid the table in front of it. The cabin didn't even have a real lock, just a hook latch. I stuffed a towel under the door and kept the hatchet beside me. The fire burned low as I listened. I didn't read, didn't sleep, just laid there, waiting. The thuds came again, this time louder. Not distant like before, this time they were close. I could hear them clearly, maybe even feel them. 5. Pause. Then 5 more. Then nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Not boots or shoes, just a soft crunching over leaves and pine needles. 1 step at a time. Not fast. Slow. Careful. Right past the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long I laid there, frozen. Hours, maybe. Eventually, it was morning. When I finally stepped outside, the first thing I saw was a new stick figure, hanging from the edge of the porch. It was smaller, tied with twine. No cloth this time, but in the center of it, someone had wedged a small stone, painted red. That was it for me. I packed up as fast as I could, shoved everything into my backpack, dumped the water, and didn't even bother folding the sleeping bag. I just got my gear and left. I didn't look back. The trail felt different, quieter somehow. The air was still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of my boots and the rush of blood in my ears. I made it to my car and peeled out onto that dirt road like something was behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement 2 hours later. I didn't tell anyone right away. Who would believe me? There was no real evidence. No crime. Just weird sticks and sounds in the woods. But I knew what I felt. I knew what I heard. And I knew I wasn't alone out there. Weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone. No trace. The owner's name wasn't in the county records anymore, and the coordinates I had saved led to a blank section of the map. No road, no trailhead, nothing. Maybe it was a squatter's area. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe I was just lucky. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I stay near towns, near people. And every now and then, when I see something hanging from a tree, wind chimes, decorations, even a bird feeder, I stop and stare just a little too long, wondering if someone else has seen the same things I have. But I never go back. Not even close. Not ever.